Before we begin the show today, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than the Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to this section regularly, and it helps us make the show. If you're a regular reader of the newspaper, you know how useful the explained section can be, especially when you're looking for an in-depth analysis by the right expert. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access their coverage 24/7. And you can also subscribe to the newspaper and find a full explained section from Monday to Saturday. Explained by the Indian Express, when news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, on with the show. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In today's episode, we talk about the problem of betting and match fixing in tennis. We will also talk about the IT ministry banning Chinese apps. But first, we talk about COVID-19 in children. There is a strange phenomena that first started appearing in children infected by the novel coronavirus in the West. What would happen is that while suffering from COVID-19, they would show symptoms similar to that of the Kawasaki disease, a disease that causes heart inflammation and which was first identified in 1967 in Japan by Dr. Tomisaku Kawasaki. Such cases have now been reported in Mumbai as well. Doctors have termed this condition, where Kawasaki-like symptoms appear in COVID-19, pediatric multisymptom inflammatory syndrome, or PIMS. In the first segment, Dr. Tanu Singhal, a pediatric infectious disease expert at the Kokilaben Hospital in Mumbai, who has been working with such patients, joins us on a call to talk about this condition. Dr. Singhal, could you first talk about the Kawasaki disease itself? Who all does it primarily affect, and how does it impact the body?
So, Kawasaki disease was initially first described in Japanese children, and it is quite common in that part of the world. And we see a lot of cases in India too. Typically, I would see 10 to 12 patients a year. So, this disease primarily affects small children, usually below the age of 1 or 2 years, and generally up to 5, but it's not common above the age of 5. So these are children, who kind of come with fevers which are not going away, maybe lasting for 6 to 7 days. And along with that, they are irritable. Then they have sometimes red eyes, they can have a red tongue, they can have cracked lips, and they have swelling over the hands and feet. So, usually, whenever these children start with the fever, the doctors don't generally think of Kawasaki. They first think this is some infection, they give antibiotics, etc., etc. And then the child doesn't get better and starts developing these other features. That's when they start thinking, could it be Kawasaki? And these children usually have high blood white cell counts, high platelets, high CRP, high ESR. And the biggest danger of Kawasaki is that it affects the arteries of the heart, the coronary arteries which supply blood to the heart. So about 20% of children who have got Kawasaki disease will have, swelling of these arteries. And if this doesn't get picked up and treated at the right time, then these children later on in life can have various problems, including heart attacks at a very young age. So, large burden of people, who are young and who have heart attacks may have had Kawasaki disease in their childhood, which was not detected. And because the manifestations are, there's something called as complete Kawasaki, where you are having all the symptoms, and there is something called incomplete Kawasaki, where you may just have fever and you may not have the other telltale signs. So that can get missed. So that's the problem, that, it mimics other childhood illnesses and it can get missed. Of course, the awareness about this disease has gone up tremendously in pediatricians in the last 1 decade. So diagnosis does happen in time. And once you diagnose it on the basis of, your clinical features and the echo findings and blood counts, then the treatment of choice is to give them intravenous immunoglobulin. And if you give it within the first 10 days of fever, then these children do very well and they recover and they don't have many problems later on. A small number of children with Kawasaki disease have a very fulminant presentation where, They are like this, what I talk to you about is like a chronic thing going on for 10, 12 days. But there is a small subset of people who have high fever and then their blood pressure goes down. So, which we call as Kawasaki disease with shock. And that is something which is life threatening and which needs a lot of critical care intervention.
Okay, so it was first reported in the West, but we are now seeing it in India as well, that symptoms which are similar to the Kawasaki disease are appearing in children affected with COVID 19. What do we know about such cases and the way this condition is manifesting itself?
So, this basically was first reported from Italy and followed soon by France and also by UK and the US. And what doctors in these countries noted was that 2 to 3 weeks after the peak of the COVID pandemic, they started seeing children, which were usually between the ages of 10 to 15 years, who would come with high fever, rash, and gastrointestinal manifestations like vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. And these patients had a history of contact with a COVID positive patient 2 to 3 weeks ago, or may have had a minor illness 2 to 3 weeks ago. And these children came, they were very sick, their blood pressures were low. And when they did their echo, they found that the heart was not functioning properly. So these patients needed, critical care interventions. And some of them tested positive for COVID on the throat swab. And some of them who were not positive tested positive for the antibodies. So that is how they put two and two together that, basically this is a Kawasaki like disease as a response to this COVID 19 virus. Because finally, what causes the original Kawasaki disease is also not known. It is usually thought that it is a viral infection which triggers this kind of immune response. In fact, in some of the specimens of the coronary arteries of children who have died with Kawasaki disease, they did find coronaviruses as well. So you have a situation where you have a clinical presentation like Kawasaki in response to COVID 19.
What are the differences in cases where children have COVID 19 with Kawasaki like symptoms and where they just have Kawasaki?
The most important difference is the age that is affected. So usually Kawasaki disease is seen in, children who are below the age of 5 or below the age of 2, whereas this COVID-19 associated pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome is usually seen at an older age between 10 to 15. And in Kawasaki disease, you have more of rash and you have these cracked lips and red tongue, whereas in COVID-19 associated disease, you generally have more of gastrointestinal manifestations. Then, as far as the echo is concerned, in Kawasaki disease, you mainly have changes in the coronary arteries. The heart function doesn't get affected markedly. Whereas in cases of this COVID-19 associated disease, you have a decline in heart function along with the changes in the coronary arteries. So, if I would put it simply, what we are seeing with COVID affects older children and it is much more rapidly progressive than what the usual Kawasaki disease is.
Then I suppose, if a child has COVID 19 along with these Kawasaki disease like symptoms, I suppose, managing the case would be that much harder.
Yes, but you must understand that these children commonly don't have the complications which you see in adults with COVID. Like there, the problem is more with the lungs and the breathing issues. Here, the problem is more with the heart. So the organs affected are a little different, whereas lungs are primarily affected in the normal severe COVID-19, which we keep reading about in the newspapers. Here, it is the heart which is more affected. And the other major difference is that whereas this kind of COVID-19 associated disease progresses very fast, but they respond much better to treatment as compared to the adult COVID, which are the severe forms of COVID, because there what happens is that the lungs get affected and they get fibrosed, so patients need oxygen and other supports for a long time. Whereas this Kawasaki with COVID comes like a bolt from the blue, and then if you do all your things right, these children recover fast. So that is the kind of difference. So it's a different pattern. It's not that this coexists with the lung disease.
What has been the line of treatment in such cases?
So first of all, these children have to be treated in the ICU because they are sick and they need lots of monitoring of their blood pressures and their central venous pressures and cardiac function, etc. And the main treatment is giving steroids. Like, you've been reading that in COVID-19 also we use dexamethasone, but the dose of steroids which we use here is much, much higher. Maybe, 10 to 20 times the dose of what you normally would give in COVID-19. So let me just put it that way. For example, if a child would receive, let's say, 60 milligrams of methylprednisolone for severe COVID, which is affecting the lungs, here we would give up to 1 gram. So that's the kind of high dose steroids that you give. Then intravenous immunoglobulin is an important part of treatment of COVID associated Kawasaki, which is not normally used in severe COVID-19. And IVIG is good, it helps these people, but it is extremely expensive. That is a big problem because, even Kawasaki disease, the treatment is difficult because it needs IVIG, and here COVID-19 associated PIMS is also a problem because you need to give IVIG. And these children are, between the ages of 10 to 15 years. So they are weighing 25 to 30 kilos, if the minimum, maybe up to 50 kilos. So they need 50 to 100 grams of IVIG. And it's quite expensive because 5 grams costs 15,000. So they may anyway need, 2 to 4 lakhs worth of intravenous immunoglobulin for treatment. Then you have to give them this tocilizumab also if they have high IL-6 levels, like you give in adult COVID-19. Now, unlike adult COVID-19, there's really no role of remdesivir here because this is basically a post-infectious phenomena. So people who have been infected 2 to 3 weeks ago with the virus are now getting this. So it is not an active virus which is causing the problem. So there's no data about using remdesivir in these patients. So that is how the treatment is a little different.
And, parents have been worried reading about these stories about this Kawasaki disease-like symptoms. What are the things that parents can sort of look out for?
So firstly, I would say that, it is very, very rare. Okay. First of all, COVID-19 is less common in children. Then even if they get it, they have less severe disease. And then on top of it, to get PIMS is a rarity. So, there may be a few hundred cases reported all over the world yet, and maybe a handful in India. So first thing I would tell parents is not to panic about it at all, because this is very unlikely that, their child would get it. That is the first thing, reassurance, because, people are anyway so stressed because of COVID. They don't want another burden on their heads. So at this time, again, I would reiterate by saying that the elderly and those with comorbidities are at bigger risk for having a problem with COVID as compared to children. But nevertheless, they should take all precautions that their child is safe at home and doesn't catch COVID. And then suppose their child gets fever, then this is the time where they should immediately seek medical help. Because even if this fever is because of COVID, most of them will recover and will not get this PIMS. But those in whom the fever is not going away for 4 to 5 days, definitely they need to be evaluated. But here again, I would say that there are other causes of fever also which one would think of, and not just this. But if the child is having high fever going on for 3-4 days with a rash over the body, with lips that are looking more red, with tongue which is looking red, and the child is also having diarrhea and abdominal pain, if this kind of symptoms occur together, then that would ring alarm bells.
You mentioned that, COVID-19 doesn't, we are seeing that it doesn't affect children that much. And even if they do contract it, the impact on the body is much less. So then would you say the experience that we are seeing in India is similar to that of Europe? Because, this is something that experts in Europe have also concluded, that the virus doesn't affect the children that much. And this is what led them to reopen schools in Europe, for example. So then would you say the experience and the findings have so far been similar in India and in the West?
Yes, absolutely. So we have also seen that children are, and this is true even in China, even in the Europe, even in US and India, that children are less affected and they have very mild disease or they are asymptomatic. And these cases of PIMS are actually just a handful. I mean, it's not that like you're seeing adults with severe COVID disease and COVID pneumonia all around you. We are not seeing that many children with this kind of phenomena. So it is anyway rare. Even if you look at the case series which have come out from all these countries, they are like 10 or 20 children, or maybe 50 to 100 children from the US. So clearly it does happen, and it is similar to what is in the West, but it is fairly uncommon also.
And Dr. Singhal, is there anything that you would like our listeners to keep in mind during this time?
I would still say that we continue to need to be cautious about COVID-19, and we should do all that is there in our hands to delay the acquisition of infection, because many people are thinking that COVID is here to stay, and why not just get it and get it over with, which is not the right thing to do, because studies show that if you get infected towards the later part of the pandemic, whether it is you, your parents, or your children, healthcare facilities are better equipped to handle it, more drugs are available, and the virus also in some way becomes adapted and the severity of disease comes down. So what I would like to say is that there are these videos circulating that now people have started going out, everybody's fed up of staying at home, children also want to go out, but this is not the time for that yet. So they should continue to exercise whatever precautions they can and try and see that only whatever is very minimum is done, and only very few people from the house step out, and they maintain social distancing and they wear masks.
Next, we talk about match fixing in tennis. Last week, the Sydney Morning Herald, one of the leading dailies of Australia, reported about an Indian man who has been identified by the police as the alleged kingpin of a major international tennis match fixing syndicate. This man is Ravinder Dandiwal, and he, as BCCI's top anti corruption official, told the Indian Express, is also on India's cricket board watch list. In this segment, Gaurav Bhatt, who reports on tennis for the newspaper and is the host of the Express Sports podcast, joins us to talk about Dandiwal, the problem of match fixing in tennis, and what can be done to solve the problem. Gaurav, could you first talk about what do we know about this guy, Ravinder Dandiwal, and the fixing scams that he's been involved in?
So Ravinder Dandiwal, who's being considered this kingpin of this global tennis syndicate that Victoria Police has just revealed, according to his social media description, he lists himself as the owner of India-based sports management company called Ultimate Sports Management. Now, this company has promoted cricket tours in the past, such as the Willowfest Australian Cricket Championship in 2017 and the Asian Premier League T20 held in Nepal a year later. He also lists himself as the General Secretary of the Cricket Council of India and Chairman of the Cricket Premier League. Now, these are more or less bogus designations because the BCCI's anti-corruption unit, the head Ajit Singh of said unit, has confirmed to the Indian Express that Dandiwal has always been a person of interest, that he has been organizing these cricket leagues, and advisories have been filed to all the players and the national and domestic players. And during the educational sessions, they are shown Dandiwal's photos that you need to steer clear of this person and report any approaches if he makes.
So, are there any charges against him right now?
There are no charges as such because the Victoria Police hasn't filed any charges. And such are the fixing laws in the country in India that, all BCCI can do is just keep him on the watch list and wait for him to make any moves.
So, how exactly is Dandiwal involved in all of this?
If we're talking about this case specifically, the two Indian origin men who are residents of Melbourne, Harsimrat Singh and Rajesh Kumar, they received information from Ravinder Dandiwal about one or more of the players. And, they had arranged with Ravinder Dandiwal to manipulate the result of the match. Or, even the players had been recruited by Dandiwal to engage in a corrupt conduct. So now Harsimrat and Rajesh Kumar have been charged with using said information regarding the fixed match to place a total of 22 bets with an estimate of 320,000 Australian dollars, which is around 1.66 crore Indian national rupees, according to the exchange rate. It is also alleged that part of this winning is then shared with the players involved. So, effectively speaking, in layman terms, they were working on information provided by Ravinder Singh Dandiwal, and they placed bets up to the approx value of 1.66 crore.
So, tennis has even in the past seen cases of fixing. Could you talk about this problem in the world of tennis and what kind of mechanisms exist to try and stop it from happening?
So, firstly, we need to realize what sort of a petri dish the lower levels of tennis has become, where conditions are such that corruption can thrive. One is the sports proximity to online betting and gambling. The International Tennis Federation, which is the governing body of international tennis, they in fact have a deal with a Swiss-based data and betting company called Sportsradar, and they are the data partner of ITF. So ITF provides all the data, all the matches, all the results, all the scores of every player, and they are the sole partners. So if the governing body is, partnering up with a betting website, with a data provider, which is, not necessarily legal, such are the betting laws. But the thing is, tennis's global betting market is huge. In countries like UK, it has soared each year to overtake sports like horse racing, and it has become the second biggest online betting sector behind football. So the data is incredibly valuable to bookmakers. Now, the thing is, the tournaments are played in more than 70 countries, the lower level tournaments. Let's call them the future circuit. So the ATP Tour, which is the men's tour, has three levels. First is the said ATP Tour, in which all your favorite Federers, Nadals, and Djokovic's ply their trades. Second is the Intermediate Challenger Tour. And lastly, we had the Futures Tour. All these tournaments, they are played simultaneously. There are no age restrictions, and thousands of players are entering hundreds of thousands of tournaments despite very little prize money on offer. These matches are not often televised. The security is scarce. The players themselves help around with, putting up the court, cleaning up the courtside area, and players and officials barely scratch a living. So they are more at risk of being corrupted than those at the top of the game. And, as the listener of this podcast, as a reader of the Indian Express, we can ourselves check it on our own. The hate comments, the messages that these lower level players receive is way beyond the vitriol usually reserved for athletes, because people are livid, they are enraged, they outright send death threats because a player has lost a match, or even in some cases has won the match and then screwed the bet. So betting is one major component, and that leads us to fixing, because the events are broadcast. The events that are broadcast, there is always a lag that can go up to a minute between the live action and the pictures coming up on the television screen. So during the lag, the people who are there in the audience, they can message punters who can alter bets immediately before a particular point is televised. And the match fixing in tennis is a different scourge altogether.
So, considering that you mentioned that this is sort of the lower level of tennis, I'm guessing it is unlikely that these cases of fixing and betting reach the level of, say, Federer, Djokovic, or Williams.
Yeah, I would say it's extremely unlikely, considering the millions of dollars these guys rake, without even playing the matches, such as their sponsorship and appearance fees. The biggest factor here, and we specifically talk about these lower level tournaments, it's because of the disparity in pay. Just to give an example, the Australian Open, the first Grand Slam that was held this year, a first round loser got $62,000. That's just for losing the first round match. On the other hand, if you're talking about an M25 tournament, which is the highest level in futures, if you are in stellar form, if you go on to win 5 of your matches and you win the tournament, you get a measly $3,600. And that's the thing. These lower level players who are, essentially living out of a suitcase, they arrive at an airport, they take a taxi, which is always a luxury. They reach the venue. Sometimes they change their clothes on court. They play their matches, and God forbid, if they lose in the first round, then it's back to square one. You've made all these expenses, and you haven't received anything out of it. So these players, let alone making a profit, they don't even break even. So at that time, if somebody approaches you, comes up to you and says, lose the first set and you will get $6,000, suddenly it's a very enticing affair.
And is fixing in a game like tennis, say, a lot easier than cricket, where, there are a lot more people involved? Does that make tennis more conducive to these scams?
Definitely, because just at a very basic level, if you think of a cricket match, there are 22 people, 22 players on the turf, and there are that many more variables that a quote unquote fix might not go smoothly. Whereas tennis, because it is an individual sport, it means there are no teammates that need to be considered for purposes of evidence or witness testimony to prove that a match was fixed. In other words, it is in the hands of the individual to get the job done. And you lose the match, lose the set, or whatever. If you're supposed to achieve a certain score, it's that much easier for an individual player to do that. There's Another factor, tennis philosophically is a sport where everyone has an off day, where everyone can have a bad match at some point. So when a player is losing a match to another player that they should be beating, given their rankings, given their past performances, this act by itself is not suspicious. It's rather a part of the game. So it's that much easier to shrug off and be like, okay, let's see, next time on the court, I'll defeat you. So it is this combination of being an individual sport and then the very little prize money on offer and the very high cost at the lower levels of sport, that the extra money becomes that much more tempting and that much more easier to fix the games in contrast to the upper echelons.
Okay, so what role does tennis's anti-corruption body have to ensure that fixing scams such as these don't take place?
Tennis formed this Tennis Integrity Unit, the TIU, which is the anti-corruption body covering all professional tennis around the world, which was set up in 2000. Now, this is just 12 years ago, so imagine it must have been that much more rampant before 2008. And that was the condition. There were so many cases that their hands were sort of forced, that they had to form this body. Now, it's a body, it has all the parties involved, it has all four Grand Slam governing bodies, it has the ITF itself, the ATP men's tour, the WTA women's tour. They all form this tennis integrity unit. So every player, it's their duty to report any approaches made, any locker room talks where, you overhear something, somebody making an offer or some plans or something. That's part of their duty. The TIU also sends security teams to monitor the crowd at stadiums during ATP Tour matches. So, like I said, it's very easy to be sending out text messages, to be sending out alerts to your bet makers, to your bookies. But these security personnel are there. They keep an eye out for suspicious activity. For example, a fan is using the phone or laptop frequently during a match, then these security officials investigate the situation, and it may result in the fan being banned from attending tennis events in the future. But like I said, the security itself is scarce, crowd is non-existent, and players themselves are doing everything. There's a chair umpire involved, but that's about it as far as the tennis involvement goes. So at the lower levels, these security measures are very lax, and it's that much more easier for these guys to go ahead and engage in corruption.
So is the answer to increase more security and do something about the players' fees and how much they earn out of these tournaments to fix this problem?
There's not just one solution, right? Because these lower level tournaments, especially now in this ongoing pandemic, where the tournaments are just now starting to resume, there have been these amateur tournaments in Russia. You can find videos online where people are just deliberately double faulting and just, placing shots all over the court just to win bets, just to win matches. So it's never going to go away completely. People will always find a way. But the biggest cause for this entire corruption that, the listeners can also come to the conclusion that the one biggest cause for this corruption is the lower amount of money that is on offer at the lower level. There are just too many people playing the sport, just too little prize money on offer. So the ITF has tried, they made a transition tour, they are trying to set up relief funds for the players who are affected. But essentially, it's a lose-lose scenario because, it's not that easy to rework the entire ecosystem. All they can do is just be that much more stringent on the security officials. And there have been successes. It's not like it's very rampant. Over the years, the number of matches which were suspected has gone down. But still, there's much more that can be done.
You can listen to Gaurav Bhatt every week on the Express Sports podcast along with his colleague Mihir Vasavada. In today's episode description, we have provided a link to the episode from last week where they talked about Novak Djokovic's disastrous Adria tournament and his bizarre beliefs that may have played a role in all of it. And in the end, we talk about the IT ministry. The IT ministry yesterday banned 59 Chinese-owned applications, including TikTok, ShareIt, UC Browser, Like, WeChat, and Bigo Live. The ministry used Section 69A of the Information Technology Act. It said, quote, "There have been raging concerns on aspects relating to data security and safeguarding the privacy of 130 crore Indians." It has been noted recently that such concerns also pose a threat to sovereignty and security of the country. The Ministry of Information Technology has received many complaints from various sources, including several reports about misuse of some mobile applications available on Android and iOS platforms for stealing and surreptitiously transmitting users' data in an unauthorized manner to servers which have locations outside India. Unquote. It also said that the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, under the Ministry of Home Affairs, sent an exhaustive recommendation for blocking these malicious apps. And the ministry had also received many representations raising concerns from citizens regarding security of data and risk to privacy relating to operation of certain apps. This decision by the ministry comes at a time when unprecedented tensions between India and China run high, and the Chinese troops continue to strengthen their position in the face-off with Indian soldiers along the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. It is also worth noting that over the period of 2015 to 19, Chinese investors, including Alibaba, Tencent, TR Capital, and Hill House Capital, have invested over $5.5 billion in Indian startups, according to Venture Intelligence. You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show, as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.